So, I feel like I owe the Vampire Diaries fandom an apology. I didn't watch the Vampire Diaries when it was airing, but I did watch the fandom, and boy, did I see some truly epic ship wars and character battles, and I swore I wouldn't touch this series with a 10-foot pole. Without fully understanding why, I assumed that the Vampire Diaries would be Riverdale levels of ridiculous, and that the series was just not worth my time, adopting a somewhat condescending attitude towards the show and those who watched it. And then I actually sat down and binged the whole series, and to my surprise, I found that I had been wildly mistaken. This show was good. I mean, I wouldn't be nominating it for an Emmy anytime soon, but as far as entertaining genre fiction, yeah, it was pretty solid. Not only that, it was far smarter and more intrinsic than I could ever have given it credit for, and had a wealth of world building, characterization, mythology, and relationships, all which melded together to create something compelling, emotional, and extremely entertaining. As I found myself drawn further into the show, I started to feel really bad for the condescension I had shown towards the series, and so I'm going to spend the rest of this video detailing what I love about the show, focusing on 4 main points: the central relationship between the protagonist Elena and the vampire Salvatore brothers, the indulgence in vampire and gothic horror tropes the series provides, the breadth and depth of world building the show goes into, and the deeply emotional reaction the series produces in its audience. In short, this is my apology to the Vampire Diaries fandom.
Oh. It's okay to love them both. I did.
Let's face it, few fans actually enjoy love triangles, and for good reason. Many a show has been dragged down by messy and insipid triangles in which all 3 characters come out looking petty and selfish. Love triangles rarely add anything to series, and are often just a way of prolonging the inevitable endgame couple. The Vampire Diaries manages to avoid this by building 2 separate relationships between Elena and the Salvatores, developing both relationships organically, showing why both relationships were vital to Elena's journey, and ultimately using the triangle to bring the brothers back together and repair their fractured relationship. Elena's relationships with both brothers are vastly different, but they are shown within the narrative to be vital to her at different points in her life. Instead of placing Elena between the 2 brothers from the beginning, the series shows her connections with both brothers, but makes it clear whom she loves in the moment. In seasons 1 and 2, Elena's romantic connection is with Stefan, and it is clearly demonstrated how his love is healing for her in the wake of her parents' deaths, and how being with him slowly brings her back to life and helps her to connect with the world again. In return, Elena's love connects Stefan with his humanity and helps to keep his bloodlust and Ripper persona under control. Their love is solid and deep, and even though Elena shares a connection with and attraction to Damon, she is steadfast in her relationship with Stefan, and the show and the characters acknowledge this. When Elena later chooses Damon as a romantic partner, it is done so after a season's worth of organic growth and development. As with Stefan, Damon is shown to be vital to Elena's journey and development, seeing her through her difficult and traumatic transition into becoming a vampire and making her feel alive even in death. Even though the show does play with the traditional love triangle in the later parts of season 3 and early stages of season 4, once Elena chooses Damon, she is as steadfast in this decision as she was when she chose Stefan, and the show allows her and Stefan to maintain a close friendship in which both acknowledge how important they were to one another, but that her future now lies with Damon. It is really a beautiful way to resolve what could have been a drawn-out and messy triangle. As mentioned previously, Elena's relationships with both brothers helps to heal the rift between them, as Elena forces the good out of Damon, which Stefan sees, thereby allowing Stefan to forgive himself for forcing Damon to complete the transition to becoming a vampire. Elena's love brought out the best in Damon and let Stefan see that he hadn't completely ruined his brother, which made rebuilding the bond between him and Damon that much easier. Instead of tearing the 2 brothers apart and using the love triangle to employ cliched and damaging tropes, the Vampire Diaries subverted expectations and used the triangle to bring the brothers back together, healing their relationship through their love for the same girl.
We are all spoken for, in some way. But
But what is being a vampire if not relishing in the pleasure of it?
There is a certain aesthetic which is expected when it comes to the vampire genre, an aesthetic which has been sadly lost in recent years. Think of Anne Rice's lush Vampire Chronicles, or Francis Ford Coppola's glorious take on Dracula. The decadence of the houses, the indulgence of the creatures, drinking blood from their wine goblets, seducing nubile youths in a wild interplay of sex and violence, the gothic settings, the dark lighting, the rich colouring and dramatic, overly verbose speeches. Many modern vampire stories have overlooked this aesthetic. Shows like Buffy the Vampire Slayer and its spin-off Angel have glimpses of it, but for the most part look modern and don't focus on the vampire side of things. And even a series like Twilight, which was largely responsible for the resurgence of young adult vampire fiction, has ridiculously modern vampires who don't fill any of the standard vampire tropes. The Vampire Diaries, however, not only employs these tropes and aesthetics, it indulges in them to delightful degrees. The vampires of TVD reside in gothic houses with elaborate architecture. There are grand staircases, roaring fireplaces, long hallways, and even secret basements. The vampires drink blood from crystal scotch glasses. They seduce and compel innocent people for their own pleasure. They are the vampires of the Anne Rice era, brought into a modern world but allowed to keep their dark aesthetic, and it's glorious and amazing and so satisfying to watch. This is a show which revels in its vampires and indulges their whims and desires. With this aesthetic comes many tropes associated with the vampire genre. There is a constant interplay of sex and violence, as well as an emphasis on bloodlust and heightened sexuality. The vampires play shadow games and seduce humans in order to drink their blood, and are shown drinking from their lovers and even from each other. In a modern era, which seems almost afraid to show this level of bloodiness, with movies like Twilight engaging in bloodless carnage, it is incredibly refreshing and wildly fun to see the vampires of TVD allowed to be so incredibly violent and bloodthirsty. And really, isn't this one of the reasons people love vampire fiction so much in the first place? The Vampire Diaries knows exactly how to employ all the tropes associated with the vampire genre, and does so with gusto and without holding anything back. And quite frankly, it is absolutely glorious.
Why should we discuss matters long since resolved?
Well, given their shared affection for both Lena and Katerina, I think our guests might be curious to learn about the originator of the Petrova line.
World building is so important in television, especially in supernaturally themed shows, which rely on their mythology to build characterization and explore how characters arrived at certain points in the story. As mentioned, before I watched The Vampire Diaries, I had ignorantly assumed that the show would be unintelligent and without decent world building, but boy, was I completely wrong. This show builds its canon and its lore in the most organic way, laying down the mythology piece by piece like a jigsaw puzzle, tracing a clear path from the beginning of the vampire line to the present, showing how everything came to be and why these particular characters are so important to the storyline. For 3 seasons, the show builds its world, starting slowly by introducing us to the main vampires and slowly elaborating on the complicated timeline and how everything within it connects. The Salvatores were turned by Catherine, who had herself turned because she was being hunted by an original vampire, who in turn was hunting her because she was a mystical doppelganger, one of which was used in order to create the original vampires, and by extension, the entire vampire bloodline. The doppelgangers existed in the first place because of the original immortal Silas, created so that a balance remained in the universe. The show manages the lore by revealing it bit by bit, until we can track the beginning of the story all the way to the current characters and their importance. It feels organic and earned, and is ultimately a very satisfying matter of world building. Even later seasons, which do falter a little when it comes to the mythology, have a way of setting up storylines and characters so that when the connections are revealed, the payoff is worth it. A great example is the setup of Kai and the Gemini Coven from Season 6, the foundation of which is built in Season 5 with the introduction of Luke and Liv and the various hints about their screwed up family. By the time we meet their brother Kai and his twin sister Jo and receive the information we need, the pieces fall perfectly into place and create a huge emotional payoff. as we discover exactly how and why these characters are connected and the way in which they affect the main characters and the narrative. It's a style of world building not seen in many shows, and certainly not with the care and detail mostly shown throughout the series, and I cannot stress enough how much it enriches the show and the viewer's experience.
Humanity is a vampire's greatest weakness. No matter how easy it is to turn it off, it just keeps trying to fight its way back in. Sometimes I let it.
The Vampire Diaries is an emotion-based show rather than a plot-based one, and it plays this angle for full effect. I personally love emotionally driven shows, so the way the series plays on the heartstrings only makes it all the more endearing. Despite all the supernatural goings on, the heart of the Vampire Diaries comes from all the relationships on the show. The romantic ones, the friendships, and especially the bonds of family. Through these relationships, the writers manage to evoke and engage the audience's emotions, frequently killing off characters as others are forced to watch or stand by helplessly, using the various relationships to push characters to their limits, testing their loyalties, and seeing how far they're willing to go in order to save one another. There are many heartfelt goodbyes and tearful reunions, all emphasized by the canon fact that vampires feel emotions at a much more heightened level than humans. We watch these characters suffer and die, pick themselves up, lose each other, and find one another, pledge their loyalty, commit crazy acts driven by love, and find redemption in their relationships. It's an emotional roller coaster, one which I was more than happy to ride, and which I suspect played a huge part in the show's success and longevity. Building genuine bonds between characters and evoking genuine emotion in audiences can be difficult, but The Vampire Diaries manages to do both wonderfully. At the end of the day, while by no means a perfect show, The Vampire Diaries was a much more intelligent, entertaining, and involved series than I ever gave it credit for. While, yes, I could talk about the series' flaws, and I suspect there will be many fans who still do so, what I wanted to emphasize in this video was how wrong I was about the series. This show took me completely by surprise, and I am very sorry that I ever looked down on it, because it turned out to be so much more than I ever expected, and I will happily admit that I was wrong and sing the praises of this vastly entertaining series for a long time to come.